All right, everybody, welcome to this final installment of the Faculty of Law Research Series for the fall term 2022. Welcome to our living room as I get to play. We're trying to figure out where the baby house can be open or Jerry Springer. And I'm not sure we figured out which one I'm going to do here, but you're full of Jerry Springer. Oh, yeah. Okay. You are not the father. But what we have today, so I'm sitting here, but I don't want to detract all from my esteemed colleague who's going to be talking today on a really interesting topic, which is, the title of it is All Fun and Games Until Someone Gets Hurt, Canada's Sport Governance Crisis. And so we have Professor Gauthier with us, who is just down the hall from me. So we talk about this all the time, and I convinced him to come and speak with us about it as well. He's also been on, I don't know how many radio interviews on this recently.
Well, 200.
200. Yeah.
It's about a dozen, I think, at this point.
But there's about 101 things to talk about when you're talking about sports governance and the crisis in Hockey Canada. And I'd like Professor Gauthier to join us to speak about a particular legal perspective, the one that he brings based on his own research and experience. But before we do that, I just wanted to let you know what he does here. In addition to being our resident sports law expert, he also teaches in an incredibly broad range of different courses, which tells us a little something about what sports law is all about. Hint, it's not what you would think. And he teaches international law, sports law, employment law, human rights. He used to teach LAP. He has been the visiting director of the Oregon Sports Law Institute. And there he also taught a course on sports and human rights. He is the chair of the Moots Committee here, and we have worked with him in that capacity. So he wears many hats. And today, like I said, he's going to talk with us a little bit about sports governance in Hockey Canada. So first, let's maybe just welcome here. That's my big right there. Oh, and I should say, you recently published a book. It's like, don't answer the book again. You're all going to get one when you leave today. It's kind of book on international sports law. So an edited volume that he worked to put together. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking and I want to turn it over to Professor Gauthier, but I want to ask him first a question and to try and kind of get the conversation started here. So tell me a little bit about the title. So the title is, it's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. So what does that mean?
Yeah, so, and that's the reason I have the Hockey Canada jersey behind me. I was thinking last night, I don't know how this came to me, but I realized that this was the first hockey jersey I ever bought when I was like 13, 14 years old. And I remember watching the World Juniors. This is 1995, 1996. I remember seeing these jerseys thinking, these are really neat. And especially this one, because you can see a partial Canadian flag on the back of the jersey. And I'm not saying I'm a big-minded person. I just thought that was really neat. And so I remember putting away for a mail order for the jerseys, like $96. You send it off. I got the jersey a couple months later. I think within like a day of having it, I spilled purple popsicle on it. The stain's still there. But I do believe it's so easy to come across as a critic of sport. You know, here's all the things wrong with it, and let's tear it down. But I do believe sport serves a fundamental purpose. I think there is a lot of good that sport does, whether it's professional sport providing entertainment, whether it's amateur sport and providing, people with a way to express themselves, to build, capacities in teamwork, in discipline, and doing all those good things. I'm also actually, I just bought Bobby Orr's autobiography over the weekend. I've been reading that. This is actually a true story. And so I've been reading that, and he goes on about all of this, about all, his family coming together and helping him achieve his hockey dream and all that good stuff. So all that good stuff comes out of sports. But there's also so much bad stuff that comes out of sports, and that's kind of the dichotomy. You can watch the NFL game last night between the Washington Commanders and the Philadelphia Eagles and go, man, it was a great game. The Commanders came back. They gave the Eagles their first loss of the season. But then you realize, oh, the Commanders are being sued by the BC attorney general for engaging in fraud because they had a toxic workplace and that was covered up and the investigation was carried out probably negligently or something of that ilk. And you watch and you see, you realize what goes on with concussions, and you're like, oh, I just want to watch a football game. But then you see someone get absolutely knocked out. It's like what happened with Juju Smith-Schuster over the weekend. And you go, what's his quality of life going to be after? And it's how do you reconcile those things where something can be so good for people, but there's so much bad on the other side of this.
And so that's what you mean is that, it is funny, but it really is.
It is.
And then so let's just maybe kind of think, what kind of angle do you bring in to think about how do we address those potential wrongs or bads that you include?
Yeah, so the angle I bring is looking at things at an institutional level. A lot of people say, like, what we need to do is fix culture, things like this. And this was often the case, as said, with the example for FIFA, right? You get rid of Sepp Blatter, the FIFA, culture of corruption goes away. Shockingly enough, it is. Right? Oh, you get rid of the folks in this sport and this culture goes away. Well, it doesn't really. And so I take a look at things from an institutional perspective and generally from what we call principles of good governance. So things like accountability, things like transparency, things like participation in processes. So, as an example, not related to this, I see Tara's in the crowd and she's been helping me with some research on public financing of stadiums. Right, for example, Alberta said they would give money to Calgary for a stadium. Where's that money going to go? Is there any oversight for it? What benefit do Albertans get from it? When they promise, oh, we're going to hire so many, people from the Indigenous community or from, underrepresented communities or things like that, do we keep track of any of this? Well, we don't. So what's going on with that? So I take a look at sort of those elements of governance and I find to things as diverse as funding stadiums or the Olympic Games or, in this case, Hockey Canada or what have you.
Okay, well, let's now talk about Hockey Canada. So that's the second part of the title.
Yep.
It's all fun and games. We get a sense of what you're bringing to these kinds of conversations. So what happened in Hockey Canada?
So again, many of you may know the story, but in case you don't know the story, the story really begins in 2018. In 2018, there's a Hockey Canada gala in London, Ontario. And following that gala, the allegation is that as many as 8 Hockey Canada players sexually assaulted a woman. And there was an investigation carried out by the London, Ontario police. There's an investigation carried out by Hockey Canada. These investigations wrapped up sometime in late 2020. And nothing really happened. Earlier this year, in April of this year, the alleged victim made a claim against the 8 players who are all unnamed and against Hockey Canada. Within a month, Hockey Canada had settled its claim. I want to say she was claiming about $3.5 million. I think they settled for I think it's undisclosed sum. I think it's kind of like in the $2 million range. I can't quite recall. And so they settled that. And what happened is, as they settled it, they phoned the Minister for Sports and said, hey, by the way, the settlement is coming out. It's probably going to hit the news tomorrow. And it hits the news. And people are pretty upset by this, that Hockey Canada settled the claim. Now, we're lawyers, we're aspiring lawyers here. We know that most court claims settle. That in and of itself is not necessarily news. But the people were upset about this. Like the minister in particular wanted to make sure that no public funds were used for this settlement. Because that'd be pretty bad if you're giving public funding to, say, fund hockey in Canada, and that went towards a settlement for sexual abuse. That's not a great look for the government. So all this goes on, and eventually Hockey Canada gets called to testify before a parliamentary committee. Because not only were they worried about the funding, they were worried about the fact that seemingly no one was punished for this. There's concerns of these 8 players, of which we don't know definitively who they are. How many of them are playing in the NHL? How many of them are still involved in Hockey Canada? How many of them might be playing on an Olympic or a national team one day? So they were worried about that. So they go to parliamentary committee, and they have members of the board of Hockey Canada, and they have the president and CEO of Hockey Canada, Scott Smith, and they testify. And the one thing, and this is where I think where everything turned for Hockey Canada, from an uphill battle to a lost battle, is I vaguely remember this in parliamentary committee hearings where Scott Smith said he made the settlement without knowing all of the facts, which is problematic from a legal standpoint to have that settlement without knowing all the facts. But also, you carried out a 2-year investigation and you didn't know all the facts. Now, the investigator did say that the victim didn't cooperate with them and things like, so okay, fine, it gets money. But Hockey Canada seemed to be very evasive, seemed to shift responsibility. It seemed to be everyone and no one's fault whatsoever. And that's really what came out of the hearings. It quieted down over the summer. And so I'm like, okay, great. Well, not great, but at least for me, it's going to quiet down so I can get back to my own research and not spend all my waking moments thinking about Hockey Canada. But then it flared up again because in these hearings and in subsequent hearings, I found out that Hockey Canada paid for the settlement using a fund called the National Equity Fund. Now, this National Equity Fund is a fund they set up to pay for uninsured liabilities. So Hockey Canada buys insurance, right? So if a player gets hurt playing for the national team, they fall into boards and they break their leg, insurance covers that, not a problem. You know, a bus gets into an accident going into a game, insurance covers that. This kind of thing, probably not covered by insurance. Although if you read their annual report, it's kind of vague. This is the problem with Hockey Canada, everything's kind of vague. And so they have this fund, and it's characterized as a secret fund. Now, whether or not it's secret, it's still not good to have your uninsured liability fund, a big portion of which goes out to pay victims of sexual assault, called the National Equity Fund. Because when I hear National Equity Fund, I think money that goes towards women's hockey, it goes towards disabled persons playing hockey, it goes towards bringing new Canadians into hockey. Instead, it's for that. And turned out they had actually 2 extra funds. One called the Participants Legacy Trust Fund. They had to go to a court and essentially get the trusts extended so they could use it for this instead of something else. And it just gets all weird. And that was the thing, is that none of the accounting really made sense. There's these sort of piles of money all over the place. The board seemed to either not know what was going on or disinterested in what was going on. And the CEO was not giving, at least Parliament found, straightforward answers. So all of this combined, and again, the emergence, when you go to Parliament, it's like, oh, that's all the money? Yes, that's all the money. Then 2 months later, by the way, there's this other extra secret funds we didn't know about. And now we're telling you that does not look like a transparent organization. That does not look like an accountable organization. I think so all of that coming together, Hockey Canada lost a lot of confidence, lost a lot of legitimacy. And then everything fell apart in the beginning of October when the sponsors left. And when the provincial organization said they wouldn't turn over participant fees to Hockey Canada. So the problem, so we can get, I'm sure you're going to ask me how it works in Canada, but the provincial hockey organization said, we're not giving you any money. And the sponsor said, we're also not giving you any money. Well, the organization's dead in water at that point.
So how does sport work in
Canada?
Canada?
Yeah, that's a great. So and this is why I think of this not as a Hockey Canada problem. This is a sport problem. Because sport in Canada is decentralized, which is a nice way of saying nobody's at the door. So at the government level, we do have a minister for sport more often than not. We don't always have one. And we have Sport Canada, which is a department within the Canadian Ministry of Heritage. Sport Canada, its main job is to give funding to Canadian sport organizations, generally based on how well they perform for them. So all the podium stuff. They do have a sport funding and accountability framework, although they never really actually enforced it from what I heard. So that's the government side of things. There's a couple of independent bodies, but really when it, and talking about the radio shows, this is what surprised the host the most when they asked him, what is Hockey Canada? Hockey Canada and other Canadian sport organizations are not-for-profits. That's what they are. They're not-for-profits. They're not a government organization, they're not a corporation, they're a not-for-profits. Which is weird when you think of, FIFA is a not-for-profit. The folks running the World Cup in Qatar next week, they're not-for-profit. That's what they are. That's what most sport organizations are, is they're categorized as not-for-profits. I think the NHL is still technically not-for-profits. The NFL is no longer not for profit. They wanted to keep Roger Goodell's salary from becoming public. But that's what they are. And Sporting Canada is weird because the Constitution doesn't set out who's responsible for sports. It's neither federal nor provincial. So what you generally have is you have like a federal body like Hockey Canada, and then they have provincial. So like Tennis Canada, and then you have provincial bodies. When it comes to government, funding comes from both the feds and the provinces. And BC has Via Sport BC, for example, which provides funding to provincial sports in BC. So again, it's a whole lot of bodies involved at various levels, and it's hard to tell where the buck stops at any given point.
Now, we're talking about amateur sporting, right?
Yes.
Which is different than professional sporting.
Yeah.
Now, why does this governance question, why is it more important, more relevant when we're talking about amateur sporting as opposed to professional sporting?
I think it's important for both. I think it's more salient for amateur sport for two reasons. The first reason is that much of Sporting Canada is funded by the federal government. Hockey Canada had a big issue when all its sponsors left, but Hockey Canada is kind of unique in that it has a lot of sponsors. If you're badminton Canada, you don't have SO kicking in however many millions of dollars a year. That's no disrespect to badminton Canada. And I've worked with these organizations. A couple of years ago, I did a study on these organizations. And again, they're very, very different sizes. So Tennis Canada, Hockey Canada, Canada Soccer, one end of the spectrum, Handball Canada, et cetera, very much.
Sorry, is there a Handball Canada?
That's what the organizations I looked at, Handball Canada.
There's something you never did.
I don't talk about afterwards. But yeah, so there are these very small organizations, and so the governance piece really matters because when we're dealing with amateurs, whether we're dealing with kids or with adults, we're dealing with people who don't have the same voice in the game that say professional sports, right? At professional sports level, you have a union, right? Virtually all professional leagues, not literally all, especially in individual sports, but all team sports have a union. So if you're a National Hockey League player, you can go to your union. If you're an NFL player, you can go to your union. You can talk about striking. You have a grievance mechanism. You have investigatory processes set out under the commissioner's office. If you're a 15-year-old tennis player in Kenora, Ontario, what do you have? If your coach is abusing you, who do you go to? Do you go to your local tennis authority? Do you go to the provincial tennis authority? Right, and this is what we're seeing with, say, gymnastics. And this is a big issue, in particular in amateur sport, where it came out on CBC again last night. Gymnastics Canada is back in the news because it came out that a coach was abusing their athletes. And when this was brought to Gymnastics Canada, they kind of went, well, but he's a really good coach. So we got coach back. But that said, we don't even see this just at the amateur sport level. We do see this at a professional sport level with the National Women's Soccer League. A report came out a month ago, drafted by Sally Yates, and she had investigated the National Women's Soccer League. And there it was found that at least 3 coaches, it's 8 teams in the league, at least 3 coaches on the teams all had a history of sexually abusing or harassing their players. There was one coach in particular who was running a youth league, became a coach in the National Women's Soccer League. He engaged in sexual relations with his players, and the report noted that at the time, it's believed they were all above the age of consent, which, if that's the most positive thing you can say about something, is really concerning. The complaints about these coaches were brought to the league, they were brought to US Soccer, they were brought to teams, and they did nothing about it. Because we can't have any of that press. The guy no longer coaches in the league, but he still runs a youth program for women. This is why the governance piece is important, because when problems happen, where do you go? And the answer up until about 5 months ago has been really nowhere. May God help you if something happens to you. Hopefully you have a board who's attentive, is not asleep at the switch.
And that's specifically for amateur sport. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, you've covered in quite a bit of detail now, I think, the problems that you see.
Yeah.
So now let's think about the other side. So what do you think would be the solution to some of these problems?
So one thing the government of Canada has done is they set up the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner. And the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner runs the program called Abuse Free Sports. And the government has, a little belatedly, as Hockey Canada, I think that really spurred them to do this, is they told sport organizations you have to sign up. So the Office of the Integrity Commissioner for Sport, they're within an organization called the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada. Sorry, I keep having to back up on things to explain all this because there's really no other way to do it. So Canada has a physical education and sport act. The Sport Act sets out that the government believes that sport's a thing, and the rest of it sets out the Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada. Sport Dispute Resolution Center of Canada hears, as you might imagine, disputes, usually over things like funding or carding or inclusion on national teams, those sorts of things. Anti-doping as well. So within that, just about 5 months ago, we now have the Office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner, and they can hear complaints about what we call safe sport. So this is usually complaints of harassment, abuse, physical, verbal, sexual, those sorts of things. So we now have a body that we can turn to go, if you're the 15-year-old tennis player in Nora, you know who to go to now, and they're an independent body. This is a big step forward in Canadian sport. About 3 years too late, but is a step forward. So this is good. So that's certainly one solution, and we'll see how it plays out. But I think we need to give it time. The other thing is just better governance. So as a result of the Hockey Canada stuff, former Supreme Court Justice Thomas Cromwell carried out a pair of reports. And one of his big findings was that governance needs to be improved. Now, what does that mean to improve governance? A big part of it is that when you're on the board of a not-for-profit, one of your big roles is to be an oversight mechanism for the boards. In other words, you're the one making sure your director doesn't run off with money, to make sure you're actually doing what you say you're supposed to be doing. To, if there's problems, you help address those. And it seems like that the boards are not necessarily doing that. It seems like there wasn't enough oversight conducted. And so I think that's going to be a big thing going forward, is making these boards more democratic, more accountable, and more transparent in what they do.
So really what you're saying is that you need to start moving away from the model of amateur sports as self-government to some other kind of governmental.
Exactly, and that's exactly it, is that sports up until now has been primarily self-government. Sports has said, we can run our own list. And this starts at the very top. This starts at the International Olympic Committee and goes all the way down. The sport has said, we are self-governing, you stay out, we run our show, sport is special. And sport, we usually use the word autonomous, we're autonomous. And they say they don't want to do this because they don't want governments interfering. Again, this is about the love of the game, all that good stuff. But in recent years, sports law scholars in particular have been bandying about this idea of conditional autonomy, where you can be autonomous provided you can show you earn it. And what we have right now is when the autonomy fails, there's no backup. When FIFA is corrupt, there's no backup. When Hockey Canada has a crisis, there's no backup. When the US Soccer League knows about coaches in the National Women's Soccer League who are engaging in sexual abuse and harassment of players, and they do nothing, no backup. So that's really concerning. And so the idea being bandied about now is, what role should government play? Now, I don't think government should run sports. I don't think they should organize sport for overseas sports. I don't think that makes a lot of sense. But what they've done in the United States following the Larry Nassar scandal is Congress has passed a law and has essentially put the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee on notice that if something like this happens again and the board drops the ball, we can remove the board. We'll replace the board. And we'll take it on as us, the governments. We'll put in new board members, and that's what we'll do. And I think even something like that might be an effective tool to put boards on notice that, you got to focus on your jobs, and that there is that backstop, and whether it's this practical backstop of the sport integrity commissioner, or whether it's this nuclear option backstop of we remove the boards.
Okay. I have many more questions, but I wanted to not be the only person who was in conversation with Professor Gauthier. So we're going to open up. Do you want me to field the questions, or you can probably see as well?
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay. So please, if you have questions, you want to ask them further to kind of unpack some things.
That's
Yeah,
right.
I have a two-part question. You might mention this, but I was unclear. So are these entities like Hockey Canada and Hockey Canada, are they purely private in the sense of freestanding societies?
Yes.
Provincial federal societies act. Okay, now, what's your response, or what is the consensus response to the argument that like any other actor in society, whether civilian or non-governmental entity, wouldn't the human rights, the provincial human rights code and the criminal code be an adequate source, as they were supposed to be in the London case you were describing? Are they not the adequate sort of mechanisms to address the concern of the young person in Canada who's being assaulted, for example?
Yep. So you got a couple of things to that. Yeah. So these organizations are not for profits. If they're provincial, presumably they're under the provincial acts, and if they're federal, it's under the not-for-profit corporations acts. So yeah, presumably, and that's why we did have this suit in the civil court that Hockey Canada settles. But what that suit can't do is it can't force Hockey Canada to say punish players. It can't ban these athletes who engaged in this from participating in Hockey Canada ever again. So again, right, if you let's take our 15-year-old tennis player in Kenora who gets abused by their coach. So maybe they could sue the coach. Maybe they could sue the organization. So that is a possibility. But the organization could just still keep the coach on. Right. And that presumes that they can get over the bar to have that human rights claim or that civil suit claim, is the organization can still say, well, we'll just keep the coach on. And I don't think it should get to that. I don't think the onus should be on the player or on the athlete to, get the organization to force the coach out. That's where that state sport mechanism can come in, is they can, and depending on how you set it up, and I don't quite know exactly how this one's set up. I think it's how they do it in the US. For certain situations, that coach can't be published. And so now they're known. And so now that career in sport, they can't, because what we've seen with these, we saw this with coaches in the National Soccer League, we see this with gymnastics coaches. They get accused of something, but they're really good coach. We'll move them to another gym. We'll move them from Chicago to Detroit. Move them to Detroit to Philly. We'll move them to another location, and it will quiet down. And that's where an independent safe sport mechanism can come in, is they can say, you're banned as a coach. You cannot coach for Canada gymnastics anymore. Whereas doing that in the civil courts, I think would be very difficult to do, because you're essentially going to the court and saying, I need this person kicked out of their career. I don't think a lot of courts will necessarily be doing for that. So it's that internal mechanism against athletes who engage in abuse, coaches engage in abuse, that does make sense in a sports center context. Maybe I'll let you feel.
Okay.
A lot of times we think of sport, we think of maybe coaches or athletes, but there's also, I know in my own experience in sport, there's coaches who are famously mean or outright cruel, if not at the level of abuse or anything like that. To what extent do we kind of as a society have to enforce some of this accountability as well as some of the organizational structures? Because it seems as if the past few years there's been all these abuses and failures by the organizations, but I also struck an on-hand example that the advertisers pulled out, and it seemed like that also was a form of accountability or a form of punishment that maybe doesn't apply in the Handball Canada case or in the Abbotsford BC case, because there just isn't the same degree of sort of public scrutiny. So where do you see kind of our sort of normative or social commitment to sport coming up against some of these mechanisms of accountability that are more structural or governance based?
Yeah. So I think you made sort of 2 points there. The first is this idea of coaches being abusive and not necessarily say sexually abusive, physically abusive, but maybe verbally abusive or things like that. And culture in sport is slowly starting to push back against that. This idea of overtraining children, again, very, very normal in some pockets of sport, but it's being pushed out against in others. And that's more of the cultural shift, perhaps. But again, an internal mechanism can be helpful with that. As far as sort of, the sort of sponsor funder thing, I think that's where the government can come in as that backstop, because most of these organizations, most of the money comes from federal funds or from provincial funds. Well, if the federal provincial government's kicking in the money, why aren't they also a stakeholder? And I'm not saying you need a federal government on board or something like that, but I think I would imagine the federal government is considering this, more so. And there's recently published some good governance standards. I think it was like from the Olympic Committee, I can't remember, because the document just says good governance standards on it, and then it just goes on. It's very, very, it's funny. You take a look at these like annual reports of these organizations, they're all gussied up with like images of people winning gold medals. They don't actually tell you anything about the finances or anything you actually expect to see in an annual reports. But it's like, we won 42 medals, and look at all these people winning the medals, and this is great. And it's like, okay, but how much money did you make last year? Not. But it's all very gussied up and glossied up and very beautiful. But then you take a look at like the governance standards, and it's like times 12, New Roman font, blah. It's like, so as a roundabout answer to your question, again, because the government kicks in the money, I think that's where the government can justify having that say. And again, it's not a big G government, it's more like Sport Canada, having that. And I think Sport Canada needs to play a bigger role in ensuring that their organizations do have their boards and their accountability mechanisms on stuff.
Professor Pillier.
So just kind of piggybacking off Robert's question, as you were talking about the problem of coaches being that, I'm thinking this sounds familiar when you think about other contexts, like police officers being moved from one precinct to another, or religious leaders being moved to different congregations,
yeah.
or and this goes on. I guess the question is, what lessons do you think sport has for other areas, or in some ways, is this an issue that goes beyond sport and sport speaks to sort of larger governance issues possible?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it's something I actually talked about with Professor Major here when I started reading the National Men's Soccer report, because it has 8 teams, it's 3 coaches, and they would be fired from a team, but they would sign a non-disclosure agreement. And in the public, the team would go, oh, coach so-and-so has left us, but we thank him for his service, blah, blah, blah. 3 months later, he'd pop up with another team. Now, sometimes the other team would know about the past, sometimes they wouldn't. But the National Men's Soccer League and US Soccer generally knew. And as soon as I read this, I remember going to Major and going, this is what happened with the Catholic Church. This is moving the bishops around. And so I think there might be lessons to be drawn from outside society in just whether it's police or whether it's the churches and so on. Although I don't think I'm saying anything too egregious by saying I don't think they've solved those problems either. But that's why I find sport to actually be very, very interesting. Is it's very much a microcosm of society. I find this is the reason I find this so interesting. Is I think you're right that sport can be used as some of those bigger pictures. No one cares about governance. No one cares about governance. And I published a report on sport governance, and it came out last year, and no one cared. What is slight back up? I published it. I went through 8 organizations, including Handball Canada, and it got released. And the collective response was, Well, then Hockey Canada blows up and everyone's very interested in governance. And I sit on the boards. I'm on a local not-for-profit board. I'm the president of that local not-for-profit board for about another 55 hours or so. So very sneaky. But governance is not the kind of topic that people get into. But that's it. When it happens to Hockey Canada, people are now paying attention. Do you think people are paying more attention to what's going on at their local not-for-profit boards they sit on now because of Hockey Canada? I think the answer is probably not no. I think some people are at least more attuned to this idea of what governance is, what it looks like, what a board does, the difference between a board and a CEO and those sorts of things. I think they're more attuned to that now. And so if sport manages to clean up its act, I think that it can be a very useful lesson for other organizations. I really think it can be. Yeah, so I really do think it goes both ways. And sport does need to do a better job of looking at the outside world and going, maybe we should learn something from that as well instead of being so insular. So, completely agree.
Let me go with the
Thank you. I have two quick questions. First one is speaking of Hockey Canada, who are the directors and how they were chosen or elected?
Yep.
And the second one is about you're talking about the institutional capacity building. For example, you mentioned the newly established office with the safe sports program. So my question is, can you put it in the broader comparative context in the sense that where does Canada stand vis-a-vis other major developed countries or countries have similar structure in Canada, and any lessons in your opinion that Canada can draw from other countries' experiences?
Yeah. So as far as the board of electors, I don't know how or the board of directors, I don't know exactly how it used to be done. But I understand that there's been a nominations committee, people would submit their names towards the nominations committee and they would get voted on. I think they're voted on by the provincial federations because the members of Hockey Canada are technically the provincial federations / territorial federations. Hockey Canada is doing it a little bit differently this time. The nominations committee, because the entire board is resigning, so you need to put your name into the nominations committee. They're going to come up with a short list. And it's possible that the short list might be the entire board, or that there might be people selected from the short list. It's not, again, not entirely clear exactly what they're going to do. And yeah, I think it might still be up to provincial organizations to do that. I should know a little bit more because I throw my name in it. To be possible director, I don't get it. So that's where directors generally come from, is they're voted on by the membership. The members are the provincial associations. And I see Professor Hillier, our expert in corporate governance, nodding his head, so I must be saying something right. Yeah, and as far as the what we can learn from others, it's something I'm starting to dig into, because I know Australia has made moves to improve sport governance over the past 4 years. The UK has as well, and same thing with the United States. Again, setting up its safe sport program. Following in particular the Larry Nassar scandal. And I think the US might be actually, I think Australia is probably going to be the most helpful, because Australia is very much a federated state like ours. And so they're in sport, it's a bit of a weird world, because they're trying to unify sport, make it more unitary to like Australian sport, as opposed to Queensland and New South Wales and Tasmania and all that. So they're trying to get into under one umbrella somewhat. So I think because the federated nature, and I think because of certain size and that kind of stuff, I think Australia has a lot of very useful lessons. That said, though, I think that America has been making a lot of really good steps by setting up safe sport. Unfortunately, they're not funding a lot of what they've set up. So Congress has set up various other commissions and programs, but they've not allocated funding. At least when I checked a couple of weeks ago, they hadn't. I don't imagine that's changed. So it's hard to say how well the US has done, because they've not funded it. They've set up. And the UK is making, so I think there is a lot of lessons to be learned. And this project I was on, when I said I published something on national sports governance for Canada, is part of a multinational project involving researchers from about, I want to say some 30 countries. It's carried out in 2 steps, European countries and then everyone else, roughly. Brazil was in the first study, I think, but so the idea was to take a look at sports governance across the world and see roughly what everyone was doing, sort of as a what lessons can we learn, what problems are people running into as this comparative study. So it's called the National Sports Governance Observer. And so the second edition, which I was part of, was published last fall. And it was run by an organization called Play the Game. It's a Danish non-governmental organization, focuses on issues of transparency, integrity, governance in sports. So that kind of work is going on. I think Australia might be our best comparator, maybe the US, but there are plenty others out there. Germany has strong sports governance. Norway has very strong sports governance. But again, slightly different in how they look at sports.
So I saw Professor Chambers and Professor Morris. So
Well, thanks very much. I was thinking about outside of sports, so it would not be fair to ask, but I was thinking about a similar sort of segment of society, which is performing visual arts, which are kind of funded the same way vascular society has been funded, and whether these problems occur in that sector and how it's being dealt with. And this is the key trust lawyer. I was thinking, does it make a difference that that's regarded in law as charitable, whereas sports is not?
Yeah, so I believe sport is charitable for taxes because they have a particular thing under the tax codes.
Non-profit for tax.
Yeah, well, so there is a particular sport thing for tax as well, as an amateur sport body. So I don't, so the answer that the charity and not-profit, I don't know, that's not that big for your area. As to, do we see these things happening in other not-for-profits? Not as much, I don't think. And again, Andrew would probably be a better person to talk about that, I dare say, but my limited experience in the not-for-profit world, I mean, there's concerns we have, again, sitting on the board of not-for-profit, we're concerned about things like, making sure finances are in order, and not that my executive director will ever do this, but if she ran off of money people do, we're worried about that. We have seen cases of that happening. There's an issue in Kamloops some 7 or 8 years ago involving the training society of some sort comes to mind. I can't remember exactly what it is, where there are some sort of shenanigans going on. So the concern is usually when it comes to like financial shenanigans, as opposed to what we see here, because I think the risk for these kinds of things happening in sport is just much higher. And that comes down to the intimacy between coaches and players, right? Coaches spend all their times with these athletes. So there's that intimacy, there's that dependency, right? We're talking athletes, 12, 13, 14, 15, and coaches who are adults. We're talking a dependency in a way I don't think you see in other organizations, right? If I want to become a pro tennis player and I route out my coach, will another coach ever take me on? Is my career done? Because if I blow the whistle, my career is probably toast. In the same way, it might not be if, say, you were in an orchestra and your conductor was being particularly abusive towards you. You could presumably go to another orchestra. It's just not that kind of same one-to-one. Whereas in sport, you can be cut for a team for any reason. There's a good reason. That was a big issue in the National Women's Soccer League, where a lot of women wouldn't necessarily report the abuse because they were scared if they reported the abuse, they would not make it onto the US national women's team. And that was like the career achievements. And so I think there are things, there's always an issue with sports when it comes to sports politics, law, governance, all that. This idea that sport is unique. And sport will say we are totally unique, we have to do everything on our own, we are completely special. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a lot of things about sport that we can learn from other areas that don't make it completely unique. I think this is one of those things that does make it somewhat unique, is that connection, that intimacy, that frequency of interaction, that reliance. I don't think we see it a lot in other nonprofits. So I think that's why it's so uniquely concerning in sports.
Professor Morris.
Well, Professor Chambers touched on what I was thinking too. 15 and a half years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada said amateur sport is not charity.
Okay.
But during that same time period, the federal government's gotten more and more involved in funding amateur sport. So I'm wondering if you think that if the federal government chose to change our legal regime in this regard, made sport charitable, if that would be the quid pro quo for that, would be a much more active public governance responsibility on the part of those organizations, including to their donors. Like as charities and their fundraising now in the charitable context. You know, Canada Revenue Agency has been a far more active structure of oversight. Would that be a way to try and, you know, compel sports organizations to open up their books and their governance structure?
I mean, that's possible. I certainly don't know enough about charities law to remark on maybe how effective that would be. I think, you know, because the federal government is funding these organizations, right? I think the far simpler road is comply or don't get funded. End of story. You know, do you want, you know, badminton in Canada, comply or see your funding cuts? Or you want to send athletes to the Olympic Games, you better comply or see your funding cuts. So maybe there is the charitable route to go and doing that might be possible. But I think the government as the largest financial stakeholder in most of these organizations, I think it's probably a much more direct line. And even in the US, where the federal government doesn't give a lot of money to the US Olympic Paralympic Committee, where it's mostly done through sponsorships and fundraising, and they're very independent financially. Even there, the US government is able to pass legislation, come in and say, you know, comply or you leave your board. There, they don't even have the cudgel of funding. Here, we have the cudgel of funding before we can even move on to the other things. And I think, again, Hockey Canada is a little different because they did have the sponsorship. So even the threat of removing funding, Hockey Canada goes, we can still run the show, not a big deal. And will they really ever remove funding? They haven't until this point. And so I think there are other probably more direct things that the government can do, but before moving that way. But it might lead to more organization, might lead to more transparency. But then it might actually lead to more overhead for these organizations as well, because now they have to be worried about fundraising and all the charitable status stuff. And there's also certainly concerns over how transparent charities are. You know, we've seen this with various charities and how much they spend on fundraising versus actual programming and those sorts of things. So it might make an effect. I just don't know.
Okay, there are two more questions from Ben and then Professor Chambers.
Maybe to force the connection to your other research, do you see this affecting the way in which the public either supports or the government financially supports sort of the sports infrastructure in the country, in the sense that, you know, thinking of a hockey rink as being something that's put together by a community or by a province or federal funding, you know, tennis sports or other things where sport is actually played, how might sort of this different awareness of governance and sports organizations affect the way in which funds are allocated to the actual place where people play and compete?
Do you have a particular example in mind?
Just thinking of, you know, like there's facilities that Hockey Canada is known for using, or that there's like public funding of some of these things that aren't directly of the team, but that are said to be, you know, societally beneficial, because if you have a stadium, then people can play and they can sort of justify that expense. So you see that affecting it at all, or just change? I mean, given the Olympics not going forward in DC again, I don't know that there's some causal tie, but it felt very overlapping in the sense that the province was sort of saying, look, we don't want to go forward with a sporting event right around the time that they were making decisions about Hockey Canada stuff. Again, that's not maybe correlated, but it's the way they could affect sort of public funding of infrastructural projects that relate to sport.
Ask me in a week and see how many people watch the Canada's first game of the World Cup. I mean, there's your litmus test, right? You know, people can say, "Oh, I'm concerned about this. I'm concerned about lack of oversight and concerned about accountability." See how many people are in the stands for the World Juniors this fall. See how many people are watching the FIFA World Cup next week. When, you know, the numbers suggest that, you know, several thousand people have died in the construction of the stadiums and related infrastructure. You know, and, you know, leaving aside all the other issues, people come back to sports. They always come back to sports. That's why it can be such a good thing for girls. Because it's a constant, it's always there. And I think it might create more awareness, but I think this awareness is going to be very fleeting. one of the people I talked to during my brief radio show circuits was a reporter from Toronto, and they're looking into the minor sports. Again, your handballs, your badmintons, your crickets, and so on. And she said, because no one's looking into this. You know, Hockey Canada makes noise because it's hockey. If it was, my question is, if this was another organization, if this was Cricket Canada, Curling Canada, and no disrespect to those organizations or to those sports, do people care? I don't know if the answer is yes. Bobsleigh had a big issue over the weekends involving its sports. A lot of people write about that. Is that the news? No? Weird. They had to redo their board election. I can't remember exactly what sort of reading on the hair, but no one's worried about bobsleigh. So my answer is I'm not entirely convinced that people are going to be really worried about the oversight of this. You think the Alberta's government's going to place a whole lot more oversight over the funding gives the breeding boundary? It's not being with Hockey Canada. It's a long issue that, you know, if you say that a stadium is going to be an economic engine to the city, you'd probably be better off dumping the money out of the helicopter. This is the economics of stadium funding. It's terrible. They don't care. No one cares.
Always good for a bright sun comment.
Right?
Nothing
but populism.
Well, that's good. You began by saying that there's something inherently good about sports.
Yes.
I'm wondering if that's necessarily always true. I read an article, an interview with Matthew Modini after, and he said there's just no place for motorsports in today's world. It's just an environmental disaster.
Yep.
And it should cease immediately.
I share that belief that motorsports, and very unpopularly, I'm going to be the most hated professor in 10 seconds, golf. Golf is an environmental disaster. So with that said, look, I think there are some sports that don't. I think the NFL is inherently problematic. I think, you know, golf has problems, motorsports has problems. That said, I think the basic ethos of what sport is, physical competition, would include chess in that. Although chess has its problems as well, and its recent cheating scandals, and esports has its problems with match fixing scandals, and you know, you got problems in all of these sports. You know, I don't think, you know, you can duck any of that. But I think when you get back down to it, you know, just the basics of competition, of discipline, of training, of all that good stuff still matter. I think those are still things. You know, whether you do motorsports, look, you can do competitive Grand Prix. You know, you can do in a competitive esport environment, or you can do electric cars. Those races exist. Do I have a problem with equestrian sports? Me personally, yeah, most of those horses die pretty young. They can't race anymore, and you shoot them and you put them down after the Kentucky Derby. That's what you do. That is, I think, kind of problematic. Does that mean all horse riding is inherently bad? Probably is. You know, so again, I think some sports have more inherent problems than others, but I still think that the basic ethos still holds.
Okay, yeah.
Are we ever gonna find the names of the A players? Because like you look at that team and like all of them are in the NHL.
Yeah.
And all quite successful.
Yeah, all we've seen so far is people saying wasn't me. And so until you get, you know, of say the 24 players, until you hit the match number 16, all saying it wasn't me, and then you're left with the 8 who haven't said anything. Short of that, it might come out. Again though, it's this is one of the things with sport is a very close community. And it's not a community that takes to people calling it out very lightly. You know, if you speak up, you're out. And so if you're a player and you're trying to stay in the NHL, or you're hoping to get to maybe a team in Europe or something like that, and it turns out someone who's a high-end NHL player was part of that, and you can point the finger at them, I mean, your career might be over. And you take a look at what happened with Kyle Beach on the Chicago Blackhawks. abused by a coach, told the team he was out of the NHL, coach stayed in. The team knew about it for years and years and years. You know, that's, I think if I'm a player and I see that, that's my concern. So if I bring it out, am I out of the sport forever? So, I mean, hopefully that gets figured out, but these things can stay in the dark a long, long time.
We're talking about flawed governance in sport and hockey specifically. But that 8-person sexual assault wasn't necessarily a one-off, at least in hockey specifically. And there appears to be like a culture of complacency or protectionism in hockey. Do you think that this culture is pushed by the flawed governance? And do you think a fix in that would necessarily solve this, what appears to be a huge cultural issue?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to solve it. I think there's a lot more that needs to be done with education and training and awareness to push forward on that. So I don't think it's a solution. But I do think having an independent safe sport mechanism is going to go a long way, because instead of having to report it to your coach, to your manager, to Hockey Canada, you can now go to the independent person. And hopefully the independent person, so long as they do the job, you know, then there's more likely going to be consequences. There's going to be more sort of legitimacy. There's going to be a more of an ability to say, I can trust that person, I can bring my claim to that person. So I think if there is more of a sense of bringing claim to that person and then consequences following, I mean, look, again, we're all lawyers, so we can put out the most perfect laws to law, but they get broken over time, right? People speed because, well, I had an eye appointment reach, or I was late for the meeting, or whatever reason. You know, coach hits their player over the head because, well, I'm just trying to make them mad. You know, I give a smack upside the head because they were too slow getting back on defense. Or you can always justify reasons why you break the rules and break the norms. But if you have a credible sanctions regime in place, combined with better education and training in that, I don't think you're going to eliminate this. But I think you're going to reduce it. And the big thing is, you know, hopefully, if absolutely nothing else, eliminate the serial killers. Like the fact that people can do this multiple times and get away with this, that is flawed governance. That's where the independent mechanism can go. You're out. Gymnastics Canada, I don't care that you think they're a good coach. National Soccer League, I don't care that you think they're bad. I don't care that you don't want that news. It doesn't matter. You're out. Having that independent mechanism can hopefully do that. It doesn't solve the problem, but it is a good step forward.
Do you know if these independent mechanisms are going to be able to have any power over university sports, like what we've seen in, you know, Penn State and things over the past decades? Because that's an environment very similar to these Hockey Canada situations, and wondering if there's a path there.
I don't know, to be honest, if this has authority over e-sport. I don't think so at the moment. I could be wrong. I just don't know. Sort of how e-sport plays into this, or how the NCAA plays into say the US Center for Safe Sport. I just don't know. I think there is room for work to be done there. Absolutely. Frankly, I think the pro league should have something like this. You know, all pro leagues should have. I also think there should be an independent arbitral body anyways for pro sports leagues, because right now, even in pro leagues, if you have a complaint about your drug suspension or you got suspended for, you know, alleged domestic violence or something like that, it's the commissioner who suspends it. It's changed a little bit in the NFL, you know, sort of a third party coming and do it. But it's generally done within the commissioner's office. There should be independent. All the stuff, the days of all the stuff being done in-house has to end.
I could be wrong, but I that university sport in Canada is funded through Sport Canada. It's like a sport service organization. So they do receive funding. So I'm not sure if the implications of the everybody would apply to something like university sport.
Yeah, and the government has recently, you know, really encouraged parties, you know, to sign up for the independent mechanism. So maybe we can look into yeah, I just don't know much about that sport at this point to be able to say one way or another. But yeah, if they are receiving federal funds, then fund the federal government, I say sign up for these two sports. And even if that wasn't the case, I think they should honor these as a show of good faith.
Yeah, I think there have been politics with university support that we've seen across the country that are fairly analogous with what we may see in a sport organization, and some of the players are within the like, next gen kind of programs that feed into national teams, so it kind of just kind of
It's all wrapped up together, absolutely. You're absolutely right.
So I think that we are coming to the end of our time together. I just want to thank Professor Gauthier. Maybe you'll join me in thanking him for a wonderful presentation. Now if we all go lament over the deplorable state of sports, you can enjoy some cookies and some other coffee, and if there's still tea. Feel free to kind of hang out and linger. We can stay in the room for a bit longer if you want to ask Professor Gauthier some more questions. This is the last research series event for the term, but we'll be starting up again in the new year, so keep your eyes open for future events then. Thank you all very much for coming.
Thanks for that. I took this